as it relates to culture and humanity and our own experience on Earth. How are you doing today, Alva?
Hello, thank you, Michael. I'm doing well. I'm excited about this topic. It's something that I'm passionate and intrigued about, and I think it's also a very relevant topic today.
I very much agree. There are many enemies that are fighting against the natural order of mankind, and we have to face them and address them and their arguments and figure out where we are going. So without further ado, I think that I will just dive into the topic. When we talk about the power of the blood or the occult power of the blood, what we're really talking about is knowledge and information and abilities which are granted to people who have pure blood, who've lived in culturally and racially homogenous communities for a long period of time. And this knowledge is presented to us in many forms. We could turn to South American shamanism, where the presence of many combinations of plants used in medicine and psychotropia, which would be difficult to understand formulation of without science, but which nonetheless exist, all the way to stories in the Bible. Not that I'm a Christian, even though I hate the Bible, but in the Bible itself, and in many other works which talk about ancestors, angels, and spirits literally and directly communicating with mankind. All of these events and processes and occurrences add up to a sort of understanding that was known by many occultists and hermeticists and alchemists over the history of the earth, that people throughout time gained a connection with their ancestors that sort of unlocked an aspect of the spiritual world with which they could manipulate reality, understand reality, and gain knowledge and grasp the world more fully.
Yes, definitely. And I do find it quite sad that we've lost a lot of that aspect today, that connection to our own roots and wisdom that we have inside of ourselves. It's been forgotten in our pursuit of logic and reason and kind of Rene Descartes' materialistic worldview. And I think it would be beneficial for mankind if we found a balance between these worlds where we could have the inner wisdom and combine it with the intellect, the scientific knowledge, and use it wisely.
That's very true. We have started to lose this knowledge, and it does have so much power in it. One need only turn even to the most whitewashed and dry of academic sciences, biology, and the history of the world as given to us by science, to see that mankind and all other living things are the product of replicators, usually described as the DNA or as processes within embryology or within the embryological process. And what these add up to essentially is the act of replicators generating us all. That every one of us, every living thing, every plant, animal, mushroom, every bacteria is the result of billions of years of replicators existing and wanting to maintain their existence over time. And we are sort of vehicles for these entities, these quasi-living things, which are used by them to harness the external world so as to serve them. We are the survivors, in a sense. We are the product of a process, a chemical reaction, according to these theories, which has gone on for so many eons of successfully lived lives. As many would say within the Hermetic circles and the occult, is that we are the heirs to all the ages. But what the power of the blood really is, in a sense, is taking this process, this idea of the replicator, and elevating it to another level where we say that it's not just material or mechanistic, it's not just a chemical reaction, but the replicators are something spiritual, something that is beyond the realm of matter and clockwork mechanical processes. And this can easily be understood because one can turn one's attention to skills that are passed down without training throughout certain families. One can turn one's mind to certain abilities and instincts which various animals and races of men have, which can't really be intelligibly explained via DNA or embryology or any other process like that, but which could be explained if these replicators are thought to exist on energetic or on a beyond energetic quasi-mental level. And it is in precisely this realm that we can understand a unique unification, because of course we can uplift and alter our blood, so to speak. We can ennoble it for the ones who will come after us if this is true, because you can affect a dream or a mental phenomena or an emotion or a quasi-mental energy phenomena, but you couldn't influence with your actions in any meaningful way a chemical reaction like mechanistic genetic theory. And so this brings the idea of the blood into a personally efficacious realm where we would imagine that one could change and alter the course of one's children's destiny, just as the ancestors that came before can uplift and change the course of our own destiny. And this brings us to a nexus where we can think of two properties or two attributes: the blood, the ancestry, the will to power, so to speak, the fate, and our own will, our personalized will, which we can alter this fate with, which we can ennoble it with which we can grant those to follow us greater power and strength. It's one of these cases, at least according to the traditional occultists, where there's a meeting point between our own personalized desires and sort of a grander ideology that might come to us from some sort of higher realm, and these two meet and form a nexus of sorts, or form a joining point in the individual's life, where the individual lives for his own purposes, but he creates something that resonates throughout time and space. As some thinkers have said, all great monuments are footnotes to personalities of genius. So I think at this point we ought to turn to the topic of what these powers really look like when they're manifested to their fullest. So to do so, we might turn our attention to ancient Egypt, or to the South American civilizations that have existed, and the Middle American civilizations that have existed throughout time, which have built great megalithic structures. And all of these people practiced a form of ancestor worship, and the interesting thing about them is that they weren't primitive in the way that we would think of some tribesmen with great intuitive knowledge, but probably with a lower than what would be generally considered normal in the modern era IQ. Instead, these people had technology, they had infrastructure, but they also lived in a cultural context in which the purity of the blood and in which cultural rituals revolving around ancestor worship were a mainstay culturally. And this allowed them to have that same kind of intuitive knowledge which traditional people have, but in combination with the power of the intellect, the potent driving force of being able to understand and analyze things. And again, these two aspects of the person or of the society and the culture were synthesized into one.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when it comes to our own day-to-day life, establishing a connection to our roots and the wisdom that's pumping through our blood and a connection to our ancestors, I think gives us power to tackle the daily experiences and gives us more options.
That's definitely the case. It allows somebody, I think, as I said before, to sort of get the keys to the golden palace of the mysteries, which you wouldn't otherwise be able to get. It allows you to access the golden palace of the mysteries, because essentially what you're looking at is working upon and with forces that are connected to you but which are eternal. So you think of your ancestors, They're connected to you physically through replicators and non-physically through non-physical replicators, and yet they're eternal if the afterlife is real, if not necessarily their own personalized consciousness, but if sort of the memory of them is forever preserved. This is a way of amplifying the individual and giving the individual a bridge into other worlds and other powers and abilities.
Exactly, and it allows us to have access to so much more wisdom and knowledge than we can just through our senses, or what we can perceive in this materialistic worldview and the experiences you have outside of yourself.
Oftentimes we can get lost. I mean, we're sort of lost at two levels. So on the one side of things, you have the fact that people don't care about science, they don't want to learn about it or hear about it, and the sort of hidden world of the microscopic, the mathematical, the mysterious yet understandable is hidden from them. And then at another level, scientists, of course, today, especially not so much in the past, are totally cut away from the spiritual, the mystical, the felt presence of experience, and sort of stultified and entrapped in a third-person, arbitrary, artificial, whitewashed reality, which isn't even real. It's a fiction, basically, like the mathematics that they use to figure things out. It's not a genuine experience of anything, and although it's extremely useful and very precise, it isn't, in the end, what the world really is, quite clearly. We're kept several levels away at all times from unifying these two ideas in a way that is understandable and practicable. So when it comes down to it, what we're really talking about is gaining the ability to get power from the people who come before us, who have created us in a way, and being able to share power with them. And many would view this process as somehow being a bit hippie trippy or new age or woo woo, as the James Randi people would call it. But in reality, it makes perfect sense. Even if you're a secularist, these ideas, such as ancestor worship, are literally symbolically telling your body and your mind that it has descended from eons past, that it is the heir to all the ages of life on this world and perhaps throughout history, that it is the nexus of successfully lived lives. It is the breathing, living result of a near eternity in time.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that we have to idolize our ancestors or think they were amazing and we need to worship them in that sense. But we do need to remember and know that they know us and that they are connected to us by our blood, bone, marrow, hope, and sacrifice and spirit. And whether their actions have been extremely flawed or extremely heroic, either way, connecting to the ancestors gives us an opportunity to have that wisdom and knowledge and learn and grow further than what we could just being attached to this life.
That's very well stated. One way that I would look at it is that, on a note of culture, that the egalitarians and Marxists and people who want everything to be equal, what they worship is an ideal called equality, and traditional peoples didn't worship that ideal. What they worshipped and tried to uphold above everything was the lineage, the race, the actual machinery that reproduced mankind. And it is not about your ancestors being perfect or even likable. In fact, many of them probably were not the best, as many of them were also amazing, I'm sure, for almost everyone listening to this. But the fact of the matter is that this way of looking at the course of humanity throughout time, this way of looking at the journey that we've made, that we've got to plug our minds into the silvery matrix of the past so that we can electrify the future eternally and continue to grow upward and onward like a plant flowing forth towards the sun.
That's really beautiful. And I think it's important to remember that you have all this history living within you and through you at this moment right now. And that to me gives me great motivation to, keep on keeping on.
Definitely. I've often thought, whenever I'm having a hard time or I'm struggling to do something, that I am perfecting myself so that the ones who come after me will be more perfect, and so that I've not thrown away what's already been given to me by the ones who've come before. Our journey throughout this world, around this globe, in life and time and space, is really a journey of making something better. Perfection is the ability to become better. If you lose that, then there's nothing. But if you have it, it doesn't matter what circumstance you're in. All that matters is the fact that it can improve. Unfortunately, in spite of the fact that there are many great and beautiful things in the world, a looming power rises over us which wants to destroy our natural existence on the earth and turn our beautiful planet into a spinning ball of fire to be snuffed out in the gloomy light of a dead galaxy before the end time of creation is ushered in. And these people want us to lose our purity and lose our connectedness to our roots, and they propagate the idea of multiculturalism and interracial marriage, which are not terrible in of themselves as just existing, but when propagated forcefully and pushed by every vector of media mind control, become a force which tears down the very fabric of existence for mankind and destroys the foundation upon which we rest. And one example of this that I thought of is the fact that I was reading Heirloom Seed Catalog a little bit earlier, yesterday in fact, and it said in it that it was working to preserve plant diversity. So what does that mean exactly? It's working to preserve plant diversity. Does it mean that they are mixing up every single strain of a particular plant so as to produce one homogeneous group that is completely separated from its lineage? No, of course not. They are preserving each individual strain with its folklore and legendary and genetic purity just the way that it was before, or even improving it, and they are doing so because real diversity is actually about different kinds of entities and individuals and beings, not about an artificial idea of having just one single homogeneous group.
That's something that we could at least give this sort of people who want to control everyone else some benefit of the doubt, is that they're actually aware of the power that lies within the blood, and that's why they want to weaken it. In doing so, harming mankind and making us be easier to control and to be used as puppets, basically, for their agenda. If you look at the world today, they call it diversity, but what it really is just one mash pot of this same crap being propagated all over the world, having people lose their roots, lose their history, and in doing so, losing the wisdom inside of themselves and their own power.
That's definitely the case. I have noticed over the last 5 or 6 years of watching these people and their media, which is of course the mainstream media, that they want us to think that the past was some sort of dark, primeval existence, almost hell-like, that people only lived to be about 20 years of age and all this nonsense. They want us to forget that there were rich cultures that existed all over the world. Every single continent, every single subcontinent, everywhere on Earth pretty much except for the South Pole. There were groups of people with technology, with families, with lives, with rituals, with cultures, and they certainly didn't die at 20 or any such nonsense. and we really have been cut off from our roots. Everything is sort of made anew of plastic, and of course, like plastic, it will burn in the sun and collapse into a few fragments that will get stuck in the wheelwork of nature and clog everything up.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not like we're saying that one lineage is necessarily better than another. If you're able to honor and remember those that came before you, you're doing that as a service, kind of brings wisdom. And by honoring your blood, you're basically honoring nature and the sacred diversity that we find in nature today, which is trying to be thrown out the window. Like, we're not even allowed to be human beings in this world.
This is true at so many levels because, again, they're doing the same thing with our food. They want that to be racially diverse in the same way, which is absolutely no diversity. Breed everything together and force it into some kind of conformity-based model, which produces some kind of arbitrarily chosen desirable characteristic, which in humans is obedience, and in plants is productivity of cheap food, essentially.
Well, they go hand in hand because that food makes us weaker, which makes us more easy to control. So, not surprised there.
Yes, that's definitely so. I mean, one important thing to think about is that our ancestors in the distant past not only were racially pure and culturally pure and lived separate in general from other groups, with the exception of things like trade and collective parties and getting together to fight a battle, but in general they lived separately, but their food was growing with them all that time, evolving with them, and they had a relationship to it that dates back to the very most ancient vestiges of mankind. And this is, of course, another thing that we've lost. And it's interesting how the Marxists propagate this idea of diversity, so-called. And what they do is they always act as if you're some kind of a Ku Klux Klan member, as if you would literally forcibly stop people of differing races from marrying or having children, and that isn't the case at all. But what we're looking at is, are these ideas good as models to set forth? So, for example, somebody could say, well, I'm gonna not be on time. I'm gonna not go to work on time, not finish anything on time. That's what I want to do. Because I'm a libertarian, I would never try to stop them from doing what they wanted with their life, but that's simply not going to give the right result for most people's desires. And we shouldn't have these things accepted in our conscious and subconscious minds as an ideal when they're absolutely not ideals. And I believe this is the primary problem that we face, is the willingness to just swallow a completely arbitrary, invented idea of moral superiority instead of looking at nature and the truth.
Exactly. And it's funny because you're seeing these days more and more people are awakening to species of animals that are dying off and wanting to preserve the diversity in the animal kingdom. But when it comes to humans, people all of a sudden put different glasses in front of their eyes and pretend that they don't see any diversity or anything worth preserving there. And just look at, for example, indigenous cultures, they're just getting thrown away with, and no one is allowed to be different than this culture that just wants all human beings to be under control of one power. And then when it comes to race mixing and such, while I think that there will always be individuals that fall in love with each other and you just can't help it, I do think that it is more natural that you are compatible with people that are closer to you genetically and culturally, and you have kind of mutual background, so I think it will be a lot more harmonious of a relationship. I also can just speak for myself. My parents were racially fairly similar, but lived in completely different parts of the world, and I feel like that really has made me feel a bit rootless and not very grounded, so I could only imagine being completely different races and the struggle to really connect to your roots. It must take a lot more work.
The work involved is far more. And people aren't doomed, and they shouldn't be viewed as just mongrelized or without hope, of course, because the nobility is still there. But then you have to fight for all this stuff towards the nobility, and you don't have a place that you particularly belong as much as if you had been brought up in an actual, stable, real culture that had the purity in its blood, in its culture, in its food, and every aspect of its existence, in its trade, and in its craftsmanship. You lack all that, unfortunately, and it is just more suffering that is placed upon the shoulders of people who get in the middle of this, and many will say that it's not that bad, it's not terrible, it's not all this stuff, but they only say that because we have all fallen so low from where we could be, with the level of technology that we have, with the level of who we are, what we have inherited, we have fallen to the bottom.
Yeah, and it's interesting because people are like, oh, well, if you don't like this multiculturalism, too bad. You need to just die off or move somewhere else. Well, there's nowhere to go. We're basically slaves to this society. So, yeah, we're going to speak up. We're going to do what we can to make people actually think, like, is this really beneficial for anyone in this situation? We lived because you lived. Because you wrote, we have your wisdom. Your blood runs through our veins. Your brightest flames are inspiration. We grew because you cared, because you dared to swear survival. We know the road behind, the threads unbind, the hope we find, because you lived. From Because You Lived by Jordi Ingerson. So we've gone over the importance of connecting with your past and your roots and to your ancestors. So what are some ways that we can do this? Well, one way is to have, if you have access to them, have photos of your ancestors in your house so that you see them from time to time and always remember them. The ones that you're able to have photos of course. Another way is to create an altar or a shrine dedicated to your ancestors that you can go to and meditate over and invite them to be present in your world and in your life. And it doesn't need to be put up in a specific way. This is something that would be very personal to you, that you have to go inside of yourself and see how your ancestors would enjoy it to be set up and what would be inviting to them. For example, in the Norse tradition, a lot of times they believe that the ancestors could be found within the plantains. If you're Norse heritage and you have plantains in your gardens, that's a great opportunity to connect with your ancestors. So you would have to look into what is your heritage, what are your roots, and find out what would be the best way for you to be able to connect to that part of yourself.
That's a fantastic methodology, and it really can help to bring into light a person's lineage and the power locked within it, I think. Another fantastic way that you can begin to realize the potency and strength of your roots is to take on the practice of figuring out what it is that your ancestors ate. For instance, my ancestors are completely German, all the way back for thousands of years at least, and they would have eaten things like rutabaga and turnip and wheat and barley, and several other species of greens related to turnip. And I've enjoyed trying to incorporate these things into my diet along with more unusual herbs and foods. One of them is yarrow. That goes back a long way with brewing in a lot of Europe, but also in Germany for sure. Things like henbane, which is of course poisonous to some degree, but which has that occult power in it, just like tobacco did for the Native Americans, but in a different sort of note. And eating these foods and working with them, even if you were to just grow a henbane plant or some other plant from whatever your ancestry might be, can help to illuminate you with a memory that goes back a great deal of time. And a lot of people don't really recognize this until they start to work with these things. They don't recognize the affinity that they have for them, but in truth, it is there in a lot of cases. Just as an example for myself, I naturally, for as long as I could remember, instinctively knew how to brew beer. And that sounds kind of amusing and stuff, but to do it from grains into an actual drinkable drink, most people, I don't think, knew how to do it, but that was locked within my ancestry back so far because the Germans had a special tradition of brewing that is even still famous today. Another thing for me is bread baking, and another is herbalism that all traces back. And some of the plants and alchemical processes that I've worked with, I've automatically known how to engage with. And so somebody might easily find, if they were from wherever it might be in the world, that they have this memory. And if you experience such a memory in your actions, it can be a great way to reaffirm what we've said and test it out for yourself and see that it's really true, that it's actually the way the world works.
Definitely. I really enjoyed that with the food. That's something that I've also started doing the past few years, and it really is so rewarding. Also, I would recommend, if you don't actually live on the land where your ancestors walked, you could still, the land you live on, of course, you can connect to that history, but I would recommend going to where your roots come from and actually connecting to the nature there and the land. And even like, if you know of historical sites maybe that were very important to the people in your history, to visit them, because there's power in those places.
I think that this is probably true. I've never been to Germany, unfortunately, but I know that you've been to the homeland of your ancestors in more ways than one, and I can only imagine the power that it grants you, because even in ecosystems that have that parity, for example, where I live, it's very similar to the forests of Germany. Like, if you looked at them, you would probably say that in general that they're like the same place, and to notice that, to be able to experience that, is really a lot of fun and is quite empowering, because you think that your ancestors lived in these places, they thrived and survived there, even despite the fact that it might be harsh or challenging seeming to many people. That was their actual habitat. That was where they naturally thrive. It is a very interesting experience.
Oh, definitely. And to think that the circle of life, you can call it, like their bodies have nurtured that earth and those trees, and it's all connected that way. So I do think that's very powerful. I also think it can be interesting and very rewarding for a lot of people to find out, as hard as we can. It's really hard the further back you get, because most of it was not written down, but to find out what were your ancestors' beliefs and what was their view of life, and connect with that and see if that resonates with you.
That can be even more powerful, because many people might not have access to the foods that their ancestors would traditionally eat or the ecosystems that they lived in, but everybody, to some degree, even if it's only shadowy or vague, can understand some of the rituals, at least a few, some of the practices, some of the ways of living that their ancestors engaged in, and this is one of the tools that will shape a person's view of the world and their experience in life. And for me, for instance, when I first experienced German symbolism, German symbols, and German designs and patterns and music, it resonated with my heart at such a deep level that it was incredible, and I knew that this was part of me in a fantastical way, in a way that is beyond words.
So what are some ways, if people are intrigued and want to learn more about their roots, but they don't have much knowledge, maybe they don't even know, especially I've been thinking for a lot of Americans today, but even more and more in Europe, it's harder for people to know their own roots. Do you have any suggestions what people could do to gain that knowledge?
There are two ways of working with things that are very effective. At least one way is certainly very effective, which is the first. The first is to create a genealogy, but if you can't do that, if you're completely isolated from anyone who could help you with it, then at least what you can do is create sort of the vestiges of a genealogy, which is to trace back your last name on both sides of your family as far as you can, and you might be shocked to see some of the things that it has accompanied. And depending on the last name, if the last name is very common, then it might be more difficult to really get a grasp of what it has to do with. But especially if you have a unique last name that perhaps only maybe a few thousand people have, like 5,000, 6,000, maybe less, then you'll find that it probably shares a common few ancestors, and that means that you'll be able to really look back and read the old names of different figures in history and say, that person almost certainly is somewhat connected to me, and this can be very powerful. The other methodology is a genetic test, which are thought to have varying degrees of accuracy by different people, and which are uncertain to be totally accurate. They're what we have today at the moment, and so we have to abide with them.
Those are great suggestions. And I definitely hope that people that have been listening feel inspired to dig into their roots a bit. And thank you for listening.